Welcome and thank you for joining us this afternoon for this exciting webinar, See Us, Unveiling Racism in Organizational Culture and Creating a Vision for Anti-Racism in Leadership Practice. While our panelists will be speaking from their unique lens, structural racism is universal and their wisdom can be used in any organizational structure. I am your moderator, Dr. Sonya Moore, a 2016 alum, Assistant Professor and Nurse Anesthesia Program Director at Case Western Reserve University, Francis Payne Bolton School of Nursing. And Alan Selker is our IT representative from UTEC. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed alum, panelists Drs. Ophelia Byers and Germaine Nelson. Dr. Ophelia Byers is Vice President of Patient Care Services and Chief Nursing Officer at New York Presbyterian Hudson Valley Hospital in Cortlandt Manor, New York. And Dr. Germaine Nelson is core faculty of the Marion K. Shaughnessy Nursing Leadership Academy. She is the current clinical program manager for the Selkoff Centers for Occupational Health, Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, and the CEO of Project Laureate.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Here you see our disclosure, and in your evaluation, you will get the link to get your 1 credit hour of continuing education credit. And please place your questions in the Q&A during the presentation as we go along, and we will address as many questions at the end as we can. Please turn your audio up as there is a brief video during the presentation. Panelists, can you explain to us why you chose See Us as the title and classified your objectives as Unlearning Objectives?
Hi, Dr. Moore, thank you. I'm going to lead off on this, and Dr. Byers will weigh in. With all that's going on today and the backdrop with all the civil unrest, we thought it fitting to say See Us because daily, because of the systemic nature of racism and bias within the world, certainly in our workspaces, we wanted to be very deliberate in our approach to say See Us. We want to be seen as the professionals that we are. Many of us have multiple degrees, certifications, specialties. We operate from a scientific knowledge base. And in addition to that, we are the mothers who worry about our children when they leave spaces. We are the wives, and we are those that are engaged in our communities. And we want to be seen, respected, and heard. And we were just talking the other day about all that's going on within politics, and this is certainly not going to be political. But many of us had much thought and discussion when the potential next vice president of the United States had to state that she was speaking. And it was an experience that is seen, felt, and heard by Black women of color in multiple arenas. So, Dr. Byers?
Thank you so much. I want to just pause really quickly to say happy homecoming weekend to everyone at Case Western, and thank you for taking the time to be with us today. It really is an honor to be here with you, Dr. Nelson and Dr. Moore. Certainly, thank you for asking about See Us. To Dr. Nelson, to your point, it is about seeing our value. Another facet of that is See Us in terms of come to us, ask us, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. If you want to understand how to approach this journey to anti-racism, talk to the people whom racism affects so directly and so intensely. See Us is about understanding the challenges and the barriers that we're presented with on a perpetual basis. It's also about understanding our achievements and our successes and our joy. And so on multiple levels, seeing is about insight and not just sight, much like it's important to listen and not just hear. We talk about unlearning objectives. Typically, you hear learning objectives. But racism is, as Dr. Nelson, as you said, it is structural in nature, it is insidious. And many times we are a part or complicit without our knowledge or intention. And so we have to unlearn in a very intentional way what is so much a part of the fiber of how we move every day. Your thoughts?
Well, thank you very much, ladies, for answering that for us. And I agree with you both wholeheartedly from a perspective of being a professional, being a parent to a young African American son, and just through the years having to have experienced these feelings of being unseen and unheard. So I think as we are entering into this new dimension for us as a nation, where the awareness is being lifted and people want to learn, people want to hear. We have to do these things and be open as Black women to be responsive to that need and understand where that's coming from. So thank you very much. So it is essential for us to understand and recognize racism as it occurs in our daily lives. This presentation is interactive, and as we move through the presentation, you will be asked to participate in polls. First of two polls are questions regarding knowledge of racism and anti-racism. Our first poll question is, what is your knowledge level about racism and anti-racism? Those familiar will recognize the nod to Dr. Patricia Benner's middle range theory, novice to expert. And Dr. Byers will analyze and speak to our results.
So results are coming in quickly. Thank you so much. We're almost there. Just a few more respondents, and then we'll give you the results of the poll. Okay, so we have 83% of the votes in, and so we will go ahead and close this poll. Of our participants today, 8% describe themselves as novices, 32% describe themselves as advanced beginner, 38% describe themselves as competent, 19% describe themselves as proficient, and we have experts among us at 3%. Thank you so much. We'll end this poll. Okay, our next poll. Okay, it's a little bit good. We have results coming in and what your knowledge level is about anti-racism. And results are coming in quickly. Thank you. Okay, so with 86% of our respondents chiming in, thank you so much. We have 18% who describe themselves as novices, 34% as advanced beginner, competent, 32%, proficient, 13%, and again, our experts at 3%. Thank you so much. Okay, and we will keep going. We appreciate your responses. We are hoping that you are enriched by today's dialogue. Thank you again for taking this time to unlearn with us. We hope that even for our experts, that there's something that you glean from our own lived experiences and some of the information that we're sharing with you today. Dr. Nelson, you want to talk a little bit about this slide?
Sure. As we navigate this journey, we saw fitting to use one of the quotes from Dr. Ernest J. Grant from the American Nurses Association and the national president. And it says, racism is a longstanding public health crisis that impacts both the mental and physical health. And then we have the graphic of the social determinants because racism related behaviors, the systemic nature with which people experience and navigate racism related incidents impacts all of the social determinants, where people live, healthcare, and that was so well seen with how COVID has impacted communities of color, social and community context, education. This is homecoming weekend at the university. All of us love and have gained so much knowledge from, and we're having a rich discussion here. But it impacts people from where they go to kindergarten, elementary school, middle school, high school, and college, right? Because we know that if people don't get an exceptional foundation, they will never end up at such a university as Case Western Reserve University. And we just want to talk a little bit about economic stability, which women certainly see. August 13, 2020 was Equal Pay Day for women of women of color. That means they had to work until August 13 of 2020 to gain the same salary that their white male counterparts acquired at the end of 2019. So if you think of working almost a full 8 months into the next year to close the pay equity gap, I mean, that is just astounding and humbling at the same time. So we have much work to do as we dialogue and unlearn. Dr. Byers?
Absolutely. And I thank you for talking about social determinants of health, because we wanted to obviously acknowledge the pandemic that we're in. And I'm glad that you all are with us today and that you're doing well. And if you were directly impacted by COVID-19, we are we are sending you positive vibes. We understand how really devastating this has been to our individual lives and our collective culture. But as we talk about this from the standpoint of organizational culture, we want you to think about the Black employees that you work with. And certainly if you are Black, you understand this. Intuitively, how people are bringing to work with them all of these racism related stressors, that these are the challenges within the Black community. And we are very specifically talking about anti-Black racism today. And these structures impact who's coming into work and what they're bringing in with them, and why we want to bring it to organizational culture to make sure that in our organizations we are not furthering those stressors. So it's important to have this background to begin with. So we wanted to talk a little bit about the awakening and how we got to this point, in acknowledging the killing of George Floyd, which was, we are all very familiar about what happened earlier this year, and the 8 minutes and 46 seconds of a Black man's life being taken from him. It was an awakening for our country and our world, and for, I will say for myself, as a Black person and as a Black woman and a mother, hearing him call out for his mom and thinking about Tamir Rice, who was 12 years old, and Trayvon Martin at 17, thinking about Breonna Taylor, Renisha McBride, Tony McDade. I mean, there are so many instances, and even since George Floyd, Rayshard Brooks and the maiming of Joshua, and the name, you can help me. Thank you. is that we have these too many instances. But George Floyd certainly struck a chord with our world, and the global uprisings ensued, and in my mind, rightfully so, that we are at a boiling point where we're saying absolutely no more. Black lives have to matter, and it's not just a matter of mortality and morbidity, but it really is a matter of vitality. It is a matter of this country's promise to us for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that we are saying Black lives should matter before we get to a point of being under the knee of someone that is supposed to protect us. What is our country's obligation to fulfill their promise to us? And when we think about corporate commitments to anti-racism, there have been many organizations that have put forth their corporate commitments. Some have been long-standing. I always think about Ben and Jerry's, who has really been a part of that work for quite some time, and some are newer. But when you think about these commitments, think about how we're fulfilling this promise to our Black employees, much like this country has an obligation to fulfill its promise to its Black citizens. And so we're saying with See Us that this is an opportunity for all of us as formal leaders, and I'll say even informal leaders. If you are not yet in the workforce, you are still endowed with the ability to be a leader. And we want everyone to understand that power that you have to change the course for your Black colleagues and coworkers and teammates. And so we're going to talk about that today.
Dr. Byers, just one more point I wanted to make. We were very deliberate. If you remember 2 slides ago, we saw the image of red, white, and blue. Because very often when the dialogue begins, people state an anti-American sentiment. This is not this at all. It is how we are going to unlearn, be better, and be a great country.
Right. It's about accountability to who we say we are.
Yes, and I think it's also about, us really caring for one another and lifting each other up. And so often here lately, we're finding where everything is divisive and we're not lifting each other up. And so I hope a lot of these things will move us forward in that respect. As we move on to part 2, inspect and introspect, this is both a magnifying glass and a mirror. Be mindful. Racial justice seeks to alleviate not merely isolated incidents of racial suffering, but all suffering caused by racism, including suffering that is very hard to see. This is a quote from The Inner Work of Racial Justice by Rhonda V. McGee.
So I'm going to take us through a very short video clip of 4 gorgeous children, innocent as they are. And we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about what we see. As Dr. Moore advised earlier, please ensure that your devices, the volume is up on your devices as we go through this video.
I had a math test. How was your math test? I got an F or an A or a B or C. I got an A. Good job. Who's ready for the second course?
Okay, 14 seconds. We're going to take this opportunity to do our third and final poll. And so we'll launch that poll now.
And during this poll, please let us know, did a racism-related interaction occur in this video?
Results are coming in. We're at 50%. A few of us are still thinking about it. Okay, we're at 62%. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and in this poll, we have 64% saying maybe, maybe not. I need more video footage and information. And we have 36% saying yes, a microaggression. So we're going to go through it a little bit, play by play, and we'll talk about it. All right. So we want to start off talking a little bit about it, Dr. Nelson. Before we go through it, what did you see?
Oh, a definite microaggression. Although I have the distinct privilege of having watched this before, and as you reenact and go to very specific points, I think people will see what took place. And as we speak about microaggressions, one of the things that we do want to say is that we have to ask you from an organizational standpoint to look at a microaggression as an aggression, because very often when people experience it within your organizations, and most of us, we're all leaders, we all have the ability to lead somewhere. The person is wounded, they may not speak it, but we're going to talk about body language, and you'll see how it does impact.
Absolutely. So going through a little step-by-step in this 14-second video.
I had a math test.
So I want to stop you right there. So this little girl, we will call her girl A, says very proudly to her friends, I had a math test. And you can see her body language. She's proud of herself.
How was your math test? I got an F
Her friend then says, how was your math test? You got an F?
or an A.
Immediately. So one of the things that was so striking to us when we first saw this video, these are 4 innocent children, easily elementary school, maybe 6th grade. They don't know anything about microaggressions in terms of what it means concretely. But you have a little girl, let's call her girl B, who instantly assumed that this little Black girl failed a test, not at all recognizing the cue that this little girl said very proudly that she had a math test, and that she probably didn't fail a test that she very proudly proclaimed she took. And then you see this little Black girl's reaction. Again, the little girl, girl A, could probably never describe what a microaggression is, but she certainly knows what it feels like, because she instantly recognized that she had been harmed. We want to stop to talk about whom we may call girl C here. I hope you can see my my pointer here, who noticed that something didn't go right here. She was aware that something was wrong. And then you have girl D, who is seemingly oblivious, has absolutely, as we see,
BRC. I got an A.
no clue that something happened here, and goes about pouring her tea. So then we keep going.
Good job.
In this moment, and I have to tell you, I have been in this moment. I have been in these situations where microaggressions have occurred. And the expectation of us is to be emotionally intelligent, professional, resilient. And so a specific harm has occurred. And now in this moment where we are expected to bounce back, because now there is a hand awaiting us for a high five. There are a million thoughts that go through the head of a Black employee at this point, right? What are some of those thoughts? What are you thinking, Dr. Nelson? What would you be thinking in this moment?
Well, you think, why would you assume that I didn't have the knowledge? Why would I get enough? Why would I be less than? How bold are you to ask such a thing in an open forum? Because there are 3 other participants, my colleagues, my coworkers, and look how I feel. And as you go through the video, again, you're going to see the body language, which is very telling. And Dr. Byers, to your point, you're asked to remain emotionally intelligent while you were just wounded. And it's not a microaggression, it is an aggression. And we have to be, as leaders, very mindful of that's what's occurring.
Absolutely. And so here in this moment, and in a moment that I've personally been in, there's humiliation. There is denigration. There is subjugation. I'm feeling all of those things, and yet I have to put on game face. And so this is all the things that I'm thinking in this moment. And looking at this little girl, she's thinking too. But what does she do?
Who's ready for the second course? I had a math test.
I was
How was
getting
your
there.
math test?
I was almost there.
I got it.
Okay. And
Who's
so,
ready for the second course?
so what we want to do is in this moment, notice how she absolutely did go ahead and do that high five, right? But notice how she changed. This little girl who started off this video proud of herself, ready to take on the world and share her victory and her joy, has now lost something. And so where everyone else has the privilege, right, of excitement and joy about the next thing, she has now lost something in this process. And outwardly, this could be considered disengagement, right? As we often hear, especially as Black women, anger and rage. And yet, what we're asking for you all to think about when you are interacting with your Black coworkers is when you see a shift in their engagement, ask. Don't assume. Ask what happened, why, what is that shift about? Because this little girl lost something. So we're going to keep on going there, but I want to go back to the poll results. We talked, there was a good number of you, over 36%, I believe, that recognize it as a microaggression. Good job. Thank you for seeing us. And there was a number of you who said, maybe, maybe not, I need to see more video. One thing that I'm going to ask you to do, because again, this is about unlearning. I'm going to ask you to resist the urge for more information when you see a specific harm happening. It's a lot like when George Floyd, we saw 8 minutes and 46 seconds, and there were a good number of people who said, but what happened before that? Maybe, you know, maybe the officer was justified. Maybe he did something. Resist the urge. The reality of it is that we saw 8 minutes and 46 seconds of criminality, of a man losing his life. And that matters in that moment. A microaggression happened here. And I want to, you know, charge you with, again, resisting the urge to say, well, maybe what does she do? And really move forward to seek to ameliorate that harm. Anything else?
Well, Dr. Byers, thank you. This was a very poignant video. But however, I want to reflect a little bit about Girl D and discuss her a little bit, because we've talked about how Girl A feels, what Girl B inflicted upon Girl A, and how Girl C kind of realized that something was going on, but she didn't really intervene. But we have Girl D, who was pretty oblivious to what occurred in that interaction. And I think that it's very important to have a discussion about that, because we see that sort of action happen all the time, where individuals witness things, they hear things, but for whatever reason, whether it's they're accustomed to it and they're used to these things occurring, or they just believe what is going on in that aggression at that moment, and it doesn't impact their world, so why should I stop pouring my tea? And I think that that's very important in the workplace when we do see these things happen and see them occur, that we can't, any of us can be a part of these types of conversations, but we don't want to be complicit in being oblivious to them.
The word is complicit. The word is complicit. And I mean, I think there's a couple of more dynamics that we can talk about here. For any of our participants who are non-Black people of color, we want you to understand that anti-Blackness occurs even with people of color. We have two little girls here who are people of color, one of which caused the microaggression, and one who noticed it and didn't do anything about it. And what we want everyone to understand is that this is not a black and white fight. This is everyone. We all are impacted by the structural nature of racism. We all have to unlearn. Black people have to unlearn. Non-Black people of color have to unlearn. White people have to unlearn. When you are pouring your tea, that could be an example of what we talk about white privilege, and really the privilege of not seeing, right? And of, again, it's oblivion that is structural in the sense that, to your point, it doesn't affect you. So there's not this need to be attuned to it. And this video can really, even though we believe that there is no intent here by these children, is such a great visual of what happens in the workplace and in society in general for Black people. Dr. Nelson, what are your thoughts?
No, I think you guys hit on all the key points. And going back to our title slide, see us, just when you go back to work, your businesses, look at it with fresh eyes and see who's in the places and spaces and what their response is when someone does something that is an aggression. Next slide.
So we want to expound on that. I mean, it was a perfect transition, Dr. Nelson, when we talk about what you see in the workplace, hiding in plain sight, racism at work, and that subtitle racism at work is really a double entendre to the extent that it's not just racism in the workplace, but is the busyness of racism, that it is always moving, and that we have to have that awareness. And so this graphic is a line of sight graphic that is to the left in eyeball. And it's a visual distance scale. And we used it to talk about different ways that racism shows up in organizational culture. Things that are very obvious, as you see to the left of the gradient, and things that become more obscure and more hidden. And how can we become more in tuned and open our third eye to see those things and to stop them before they cause harm? So some of the more obvious things that we all can agree we would not tolerate in the workplace: racist slurs, racist jokes, racism-related bullying. These are things that are just apparent, and we would stop right away. As we move down that gradient thing, though, you have things like microaggressions, which we just discussed. So it makes sense that people may not notice them as much, or may feel like they need more information or need to understand it more.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
Dr. Byers. Something as simple as when candidates are interviewed, have any of the people that are attending this webinar said they spoke well?
Mhm.
Well, if you have a credentialed person who has certifications and has a work portfolio, they would speak well. So when you're doing your behavioral interviewing, when you say that about candidates of a specific hue, if you're not saying it about all of the candidates, we ask that you reflect and think about that. Because when you're speaking to other leaders, particularly Black women of color leaders, and you make a statement, that hurts, and it is a microaggression, if you will. And Kinsey says it's an aggression, it's not a microaggression. So we just ask people to think differently and wider and continue to partner. I know you're going to speak about two other points.
Yeah, I mean, and that's an absolute correct point. And so then when I come to you as a Black employee or teammate or colleague and say that a microaggression occurred, and you say, Ophelia, race can't be your go-to. Everything's not racial. Maybe it's you. Maybe you have to look at it differently. Then we get into gaslighting, right? And the cognitive dissonance that occurs when someone then says to themselves, is it me? Maybe that wasn't what they meant, right? And so we have to make sure that how are we responding when someone comes to us and say, a harm happened to me, a racism related harm happened to me? Is our immediate thought to say, maybe you should see it differently? One of the other things that tends to become more obscure to us when we talk about our commitments, our organizational commitments to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, we do tend to think about hiring more diverse teams. But do we think about the lack of diversity in the C-suite? That's one of the things that becomes more obscure. Why? Because of the structural nature of racism, right? We are not accustomed to seeing Black people in the C-suite. So therefore, it doesn't stand out to us a lot of times that there are none, or there's only one. So those are some of the things that we need to be thoughtful about. The glass cliff. Let's talk a little bit about that, Dr. Nelson. That's really a big one. Just giving some background to that. The glass cliff is something that's described for women leaders. Traditionally, there is this idea of TMTM, think manager, think male. And so the glass cliff is about when women do have the opportunity to have leadership roles or key leadership roles, it's often in a time of crisis, when there's a cleanup that needs to happen, when things have gone wrong, and then that's usually when we get our turn. I would like to go even further with that, using a concept, if you will, or a construct by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw called intersectionality, where there are multiple systems of oppression at work. For Black women in particular, that you're not only dealing with racism, sexism as a woman, but also with racism, and how those two things together compound harms. And so the glass cliff for Black women leaders, what would you like to say about that?
Yeah, and we ask again that you go back to your respective organizations, because very often, as Dr. Byers just alluded to, they get the chance where the perception is that they're there to clean up, or we're going to give them an option now. And when they are not abundantly successful, and that may be from the bottom line perspective, the dollar value, well, we gave them an opportunity. You gave them an opportunity. It may be in healthcare, which is my space of operation during a pandemic, to lead at the worst possible time when there was a crisis. And then, along with that, how much support did they get? But I think we have to go on because we're sensitive to time, and
Or,
this is such a
well,
deep topic.
sure.
Mhm.
Sure, it is. It is a really big topic. And I think the most important point is understanding that, yes, it's a wonderful opportunity, but what supports are put in place to ensure that this leader who's leading in a time of crisis is set up to succeed. And I'd like to finish out talking a little bit about racism-related stress as one of the very obscure things. Again, going back to something that we talked about earlier about the burden, if you will, that Black employees are often bringing into work because of the stressors outside of work. Racism-related stress, there is evidence of it contributing to high blood pressure and other types of physical manifestations of that stress. Asking your employees how they're doing, not contributing to that stress, but knowing that that is a real factor. That is, my doctoral research at Case was on racism-related stress in Black and African-American nurses. And it was very interesting to find out that all of these educated women, doctorate level, bachelors, clinical nurses, leaders, describe themselves as having low resilience. And it does not mean that they are not productive. It means that on the inside, they are struggling with the stressors related to racism in society and in the workplace.
Thank you, ladies. This is such a powerful slide and discussion, and for me, it really hits home when you guys were talking about the term microaggressions being assaults. And it resonated with me to think about how many of these assaults must one encounter before you believe that your aggressor is committing a felonious act upon you. Having experienced practically all of these areas in my personal and professional life, microaggressions and gaslighting, I think, impact me the most because they are of a very conscious nature. And I'm just interested in which of these things on this line of sight impacts you guys the most.
I would say because people are not going to do the obvious anymore, um, the microaggressions, the gaslighting, and the glass cliff as we move in spaces, think of promotional opportunities. Um, it impacts your career and your ability to provide for your family, and it impacts your mental and physical well-being. So much more to discuss, to learn, but the conversation will continue.
Absolutely. Thank you for
Well,
asking that question. I will say that
before you
certainly.
go on, Dr. Byers, before you go on, sorry to interrupt, but I just noticed we did have a question from our group, and I thought it was very important that we answer it here. Someone wants to know, what is gaslighting?
Oh, wow. Great question. Thank you for asking. So there is a British play called Gaslight. And to just give a synopsis of the plot there, there is a woman and her husband where the woman is in their home. If I'm not mistaken, there's a light that comes on, and her husband is saying, "There's no light." And she's basically being driven to the brink of insanity because she's seeing this light and this gaslight, and her husband is saying, no, it's not there. The plot is thicker than that. But the idea is that someone is saying that what you're seeing that's troubling to you is not real. It's not there. So again, if I am saying this, you know what, I went for this job and I'm more experienced, I'm doctorally prepared, I have all of these things, and someone who has not even a modicum of my experience got the job, and I believe it's because I'm Black. And someone saying, as I said earlier, race can't be your go-to. That can't be always the reason that you use. Maybe you need to look at things differently. No, they would never do that. And then you start to question your own sanity. And that is a racism-related stressor, because then that's where the cognitive dissonance comes in, where you know that you were harmed, but then you're made to believe that you weren't, and you start to internalize and accept that. And so thank you so much for asking that question. And we'll move along.
So this has been so powerful thus far. In light of where we are, I think with a tumultuous 2020 and calls for equality and justice in all facets of life, everyone is looking for solutions. How do we move forward? Let's look ahead and let's move forward.
See us, ask better questions. And I'm going to go through this. What are the biggest barriers to your success? Ask that question of the people that you engage with, your employees. Do you feel psychologically safe enough to take risks at work, to belong to part of the community? What percentage of your time is spent addressing exclusion or microaggressions? I think if you ask people that question, you would be totally humbled by the response. And how can I help amplify your voice and understand those that are underrepresented? And whose voice or perspective is missing from the conversation? Going back to the point when you're asking questions, when you're at meetings, when you're in a space, whose voice is missing? And how can you play a part of changing that narrative? We're going to talk about ally being a verb, but now that we've had this discussion, and again, homecoming weekend, and here at Case, such a great university, we just ask that you go back and see us and ask better questions. So thank you.
Absolutely. And when we ask these questions, one of the things I will say as a nurse executive, when all of the unfortunate and tragic situations happened with George Floyd, and since then, I have very intentional one-to-ones with Black leaders to ask them how they're doing. One, understanding the impact of racism-related stress, letting them know that they have a space where they can talk about it in a very intentional and open way. And these better questions to ask are questions that you can ask in those moments. Also, in asking whose voice or perspective is missing from the conversation, it's a great question to ask, because remembering that I'm only an expert in Ophelia's lived experiences as a Black woman. I'm not an expert in Dr. Nelson's or Dr. Moore's or anyone else. I cannot speak holistically for the Black race. And so that it's not asking one person and then moving on. It really is gathering a wealth of perspectives and moving on from there. It's also understanding that we all have to do our own work and our own labor. And so making sure that we are not counting on that Black person in our sphere, in our organization, to be that voice and to do that labor. That the way to unlearn is to do the labor ourselves. And so it is wonderful to ask whose voice or what perspective is missing, but it's as important for us to go seek that knowledge ourselves. The resources are there. You will, as a part of this webinar, receive a list of resources, both books, as well as video series that Dr. Nelson and I have curated for you. Please do the work, because one of the things that adds to racism-related stress is asking Black people in your circles to do that labor for you. And so these questions are absolutely key. Ask them with intention and with truly seeking to unlearn, not only to ask better questions, but to do better work. And that's what we're going to talk about next. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about envisioning anti-racism and leadership practice, we wanted to talk about it from a lens that we think that everyone can understand, and that is quality management. And we decided on using this framework because we realized that there's no industry that does not have quality and performance improvement as its cornerstone. That literally is what drives business. It's what attracts customers. It's what attracts quality employees. It's what makes sure that your goods and services are top notch. And so we figured whether you are a hospital, a Fortune 500 company, a nail salon, a factory, quality and performance is important and key and integral to the work that you do. And so how do we look at anti-racism as a quality and improvement objective, right? And not an initiative and not something that's a task force or a committee, but literally something that is a part of your organizational structure. Because if we acknowledge that racism is structural, then anti-racism as an equal and opposite force has to also be structural. And so we took the 7 quality management principles from the ISO 9000. The ISO is an international organization that sets the quality standards for the world. And these are their 7 quality principles, quality management principles, and we're going to go through them with you today. Dr. Nelson, you want to talk a little bit about the customer focus?
Yes, and who are your internal customers? Who are your external customers? Certainly, if you're a leader in an organization, your internal customers are your employees, but you have vendors. And really, I ask that you hone down and look at what is going on with your employees. So we are not adding to stress. We are not saying that the stress is not there. We talked about gaslighting. And very often people are told, oh, that's not what happened. But we ask you to dig a little deeper, observe, be intentional. We used that word earlier about what it is you're seeing, and listen. And sometimes you have to go back and just stand against the wall and look and see what is going on.
Absolutely. And that's where the leadership piece comes in. And again, remember that everyone is empowered to lead. You do not have to have a formal leadership role. You going back to your institution and saying, you know what, kudos to us for embarking on this journey of anti-racism and putting our commitments forth. But I have this framework, this quality management framework, and Dr. Byers and Dr. Nelson and Dr. Moore made the suggestion that we look at whatever initiative that we're working on and apply this framework and ensure that every element of this framework is evident in the initiative that we're working on. And are our goals measurable, right? And so it's not just about, again, doing this thing that sounds good, but does it have a framework in place that ensures quality and sustainability? Because this is a journey, right? It's a marathon, not a sprint, as we've heard in many in many other descriptions of quality improvement. Engagement of people, making sure that everyone in your organization knows what the commitment is, right? Evangelizing anti-racism, saying this is who we are. And so we are talking about it in every possible, we are infusing it, that it's not a separate journey, but that is literally infused in how we move on a daily basis, just like all of your other quality metrics. And as Dr. Nelson talked about, ally is a verb. It is what you do. It is not who you are, because it is a journey. Want to talk about what that work looks like?
And that work looks like, again, asking the key stakeholders, the employees, but again, not asking them to do the work, but they have to be included in the process. This is not that you pick up a document, a portfolio, a binder, a podcast. This is about engagement of a team of people, partnering with them, which is action oriented, the verb aspect of it, and really digging in and doing the work that is so needed. And if you're going to sit on the sideline and say this is not happening, we ask that you again go back and look at these 7 quality management principles and really pull apart the thing that we believe is not happening, and you will see it from the customer focus, leadership, engagement. And we're going to talk about the evidence-based decision making, where you consult experts, as Dr. Byers said, not just going to the employees saying, tell me, because they're tired. They've experienced all of these elements, and they're trying to be engaged at work and thrive in an environment that sometimes is not optimal. From that, use the resources that we curated, and I love that word, involve the team. Dr. Byers, I'm going to pitch back to you.
Yeah,
well.
and there are experts that do this work. We ask you to invest. There are speakers, there are consultants, there are people who know how to lead organizations to success around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and anti-racism. Invest in it. This is not the effort to save money on, because the return on your investment is going to be so great that it is worth doing. We say cite your sources, and that's important when we talk about engaging Black thought and feedback. Is that one of the most important things you can do is amplify, right? And make sure that when you ask for our voices, that you amplify those and give credit to the contribution. And it obviously involve the team in the decision-making process. For the process approach, include the customer in planning, hearkening back to the internal customer, which is your employees as well as your clients. Make sure that they are a part of the process, and agree that, as I move on to the next improvement, agree that the improvements that are being made is what they asked for. I jokingly refer to when we last talked, Dr. Nelson, about the NFL saying, we're going to play the Black national anthem at the beginning of every game. And Black folks said, we didn't ask for that. We asked you to reinstate Colin Kaepernick. So making sure that we are not deciding what you should have, but really asking what you want and delivering that as in a meaningful way and as appropriate as possible. But just making sure that we are amplifying and allying means giving people what they asked for. And then finally, in relationship management, making sure that we're sustaining engagement to continuously improve, remembering that it is an ongoing process, that it is a journey, that it's not about quick wins. It really is about doing meaningful work and where people are more and more feeling like this is the place that I want to be in. This is the team I want to be a part of. And I recognize that it's work, and I recognize that it's not going to be perfect. But I see the intent, and I want to be a part of that work. And so we're hoping that you see the value in this approach, and that there's a lot of process measures along the way, the diversity statistics in terms of hiring, pay equity, all of those are process metrics and measures to ultimately achieve the goal of an anti-racist organizational culture.
Thank you, Dr. Byers and Dr. Nelson. You know, this is truly, I think, a good plan for people to take back to their organizations and put their own culture into it to be successful in this area. And so, can one of you guys just describe to us what a tool like amplification would do to improve our pipelines into the area of management, leadership, and C-suite positions?
Well, the amplification of that again looks like allyship, sponsorship, recognizing that if your C suite is not already diverse, how are you going to move the needle and get there? Is it through internal programs? I shudder to think because we just had the big issue with Wells Fargo where they said that they didn't have the talent. And there was a backlash within that organization because the talent was saying, hey, I'm right here. So the amplification, if they use the 7 quality management principles, would have been to go to the employees to say, hey, we're looking for people with these core competencies or abilities. Is there anyone on your team with those? Can you have them reach out to HR? Do you know what projects that they're working on? Because this is what we so richly need. So that's how it gets amplified. But you have to be a good steward of the questions and your organization. I look often because people will say we're looking for the talent. And it's like if you did a hashtag on your website, I'm sure you would probably get 20 names within a very short period of time. So that's how I see the amplification. But again, I agree with Dr. Byers, you, Dr. Moore. It is a process. And this could be one of the frameworks that's used to get people to where amplification occurs with a pipeline, if you will.
And I will just say very quickly, I know we only have a couple of 3 minutes, but I will say very, very quickly that it is not just about putting faces there. It's not just about saying, okay, we have a new Black person, but it is understanding that when you are making that shift, that not only do you have to support that person, as you said, sponsorship, but you have to support the culture, because the culture is not accustomed to seeing a Black person in the C-suite. And so you have to support the culture in that change, because you can see acting out. You can see pushing back. And again, it is about it being a change. And so it's about change management, which is a leadership competency. How do you manage this change? It's not just about representation, but it's about facilitation.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you to our panelists for this fantastic presentation. This will start the question and answer portion. Please type your questions in the Q&A. And we do have a question there, and it says, what do you do if you feel you have been microaggressed or gaslighted?
Mm.
That's a really good question. So
I
I
would say,
would say I can take that question.
ahead.
You know, I'm the moderator, but I can take that question because, like I said earlier, I've been microaggressed and gaslighted multiple times. And I think a part of it is truly knowing who you are and having that respect for yourself in order to take that information, process it, okay, and still being respectful in your response to let that individual know that that was inappropriate and it's not something that you are willing to tolerate as you grow as a person. And I think that that's very important for us to be self-aware and understand where our feet are rooted so that when we respond to these things, we are justified within our response. And you should always feel justified
That's
in
right.
calling out these things.
That's right. Address it head on to that person. Let them know that you were harmed by that what they said did not feel good. This is how you perceived it, and you would like to understand what belies that comment. That is the start. Self-advocacy. You are justified.
Okay, and so we have a question from Jane Miller, and she would like to know, how do you work to help the disenfranchised to feel safe to approach mental health and physical health?
I can take that. I think you have to weave it into your 7 quality management principles and the work that your organization is going to do related to moving to an anti-racism environment. And I know Dr. Byers would like to weigh into it because it's her research, right? But you have to have a safe space for people to have the discussion. You have to have a safe place where people can report. In my organization, now there's a line where people can call in to say if they have concerns. And it is not a punitive process. It is going to be one where there's additional resources that may be devoted to a particular area, a leader, and so forth. This is not new that it is happening. It is new that people are feeling that they can speak up about it and not be ostracized or removed from an organization. So you have to weave it into the fabric of what is going on within your organization. And to say that it is safe for people to have a conversation, and it is safe for people to say what is occurring.
Absolutely. I have nothing to add to that. Improve your structures.
Yes.
All right. So we don't have any more questions, but we do have a comment from Michelle Clark that I think is very interesting. She's saying, I was surprised that the little girl didn't say something to the other girl when she insulted her. And I want to say, when I was that age, I didn't know if I was informed enough to do so. I think it's a learning process and something that you grow into.
I would like to speak to that. I want to talk a little bit about, and Michelle, thank you for that question. And I appreciate your comment and the intent. And so please understand mine. There is this, I want to talk a little bit about my research and when I learned that all these amazing Black women, Black nurses, varying degrees and experience and roles, would describe themselves as having low psychological resilience. And my initial reaction was, what? Right? My initial, I couldn't believe it. And I had to check myself. I had to check the structural nature of racism in myself, that could not believe that Black women weren't strong. Right? I could not believe that we were not strong, because that is how we're supposed to be, strong Black women. We're supposed to have it all together. That concept that we often sometimes take pride in is rooted in racism, because it does not allow us to be vulnerable. It does not allow us to be human. We have to be superhuman, right? We have to withstand harm. And so this little girl was allowed to be vulnerable in that moment. She was allowed to be shocked. She was allowed to be disappointed and humiliated, as opposed to saying, well, let me tell you about yourself, right? And so I would like us to allow ourselves that space to be vulnerable, to be human, to have a reasonable reaction to harm, and not feel that we have to be Teflon. And that's why these structures are so important, to have resources in place to kind of rush to, the way white blood cells kind of rush to an area that has where there's injury, right? To rush in and provide support, as instead of feeling that we have to be strong and withstand. To your point, that comes with time, and it comes with development, and it comes with knowing that you have structures in place, as you said, Dr. Nelson, that support you. But you don't always know that, because I can tell you in real life, if that little girl had given a hard time, she may have been removed by the teacher or whoever was the adult facilitator in the room. Her mom may have been called and said that she was being aggressive or sassy or angry. And so that is what we struggle with when we don't, in that moment, when the little girl had her hand up, she might have wanted to say something. But all the things that go through our heads in milliseconds, and how we need to moderate ourselves internally to make sure that we don't appear a certain way. So I would ask you to think about all those different variables when we are wondering why someone didn't stand up for themselves.
And I would say it's not only the little girl. In workspaces, full-blown adults, if that's such a thing, are not going to say anything, but they still feel it. They carry it. Again, to your point that you made earlier, if they react to it, they're the argumentative, combative, not engaged, not team player employee. But again, that's why we ask you to go back to your organizations and see if there's a framework, but also watch. When we talk about allyship, it cannot be only the employee that was targeted, if you will, that speaks to the behavior that is within a unit, or within an organization, or within a workspace. So it's shifting the thought differently, because there are adults that would not say anything, that might raise their hand or might say, what happened? Did that happen? Did what happened really occur? Did no one else see it? But they're not going to speak on it because the forum may not be one that would allow them to have the conversation at that particular time.
Ladies, we have one more question and a comment that popped up. So I'm going to read you Tamara Nelson's question. How about when they deny it, but you want to be firm in your definition of what has happened? And I know, and I understand that question, because in the heat of the moment, you want to address it one way, but when you reflect, you think to address it another way.
I think you have to count backwards, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, so you don't respond in what may be perceived as combative. And then I go back to my early training, when you trained people with CPR and ACLS, the whole part whole. So the whole is what just occurred. The part is the synopsis that you're going to give with what the person did. And then the whole again is what the behavior needs to change and look like differently. So I think if you compartmentalize it that way when you're having a discussion, take that deep breath and pause, because very often if you respond immediately right then, it may not be the best. But speak to the behavior and then share with the person how the behavior can change or why they should not do it again. What was the terrible? So with the video, it's, you said I got an F. Why would you make that presumption? And then you can tell them what that looks like, that no one else in the table is a person of color. You made the assumption that I got an F. I am, a great student, and this is why. And in the future, don't assume that someone who looks like me got an F. Let them tell you what their grade is, and maybe the narrative changes.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Nelson. And from Dr. Patricia McDonald, I just want to read this to our panelists. For the panelists and moderators, have you considered taking this show on the road? Indeed, in this age of the pandemic, any organization that is interested in truly making a difference in their organization from a cultural standpoint, they would purchase this video as an educational guideline. Thank you, Dr. McDonald, and I'm sure the panelists will thank you as well. And thank you to all of you that have hung in here with us. We know we are a little bit past time, but we would also like to acknowledge the many individuals that assisted us and encouraged us and were open to letting these ladies speak their truth during this presentation. I want to say thank you and enjoy the rest of your day and the many homecoming events at Case Western Reserve University this weekend. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. Thank you, Dr. Nelson.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. Thank you, Dr. Byers. And thank you, Maria and Dr. Fitzpatrick, of course.
Absolutely. And Alan.
Alan, don't forget.
Alan, yes, Alan, thank you. Have a great day, everybody.